All right, so what we're going to do is let people populate in. I sent out an email saying we were just a couple of minutes behind, which is not a problem.
My fault.
That's all right. These things happen. Hello, everybody. Sorry for the delay. We were trying to get this thing to work. You know, technology can be a fickle thing sometimes. So we're here, and of course, we're happy to have John Emison from Tennessee. He's got the colors on. He's representing Tennessee. But this is the Abbeville Institute first webinar of 2024. So this is really exciting for us. We've got a great year plan for these things, and we wanted to kick it off, being that it's January, with a book from our good friends at Shotwell Press, The Deep State Assassination of Martin Luther King. So um, Mr. Emison is a mayor in Tennessee and also an author. And I've read this book and I've read his other works too. And this is a more personal book than anything you've written before. And so I wanted to have you on and talk about it because I think it's such a great topic and an interesting topic. And one of the things I'll say about this before we get started is that you're very sympathetic to King. I mean, this is a book where you take a position of there was a political figure assassinated, and you wanted to find out who really did it, why they did it, and not have a fall guy. So I found that to be a really great way to view this topic. One other thing, of course, we do exist on your generous contributions alone. So if you love the Abbeville Institute and you like what we do, please consider a donation. We will have more of these this year. So I'm going to turn this over to John. He's going to talk to you for about 20 or 25 minutes, and then we'll take questions. You can click that Q&A button at the bottom, or you can put your questions in the chat. And of course, we can do them that way. So John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Brian, and thank you for the Abbeville Institute for inviting me to participate in this webinar. And I want to give a special thank you to Dr. Paul Graham and Professor Clyde Wilson, who at Shotwell Publishing. They did an excellent job at finishing this book in terms of getting it all put together, and a great deal of the measures of the success of this book I share with them. So I want to give you an overview of what I'm going to say so everybody can kind of be mulling on that. We're going to discuss four things. The first thing we're going to discuss is, why did this happen? Why did this crime happen? Because everybody wants to know that. And we're also going to discuss the background of the crime. We will discuss what I call the orchestration of the storyline, the government's storyline for many decades now, which is still with us. And one of the reasons that the deep state is discussed today in more than one presidential campaign and in Fox and other venues of media. And then we'll talk about the fingerprints of CIA, because it was the CIA who murdered Martin Luther King, no doubt about that. So we'll jump right in. So why was Martin Luther King killed? Well, King was inching closer and closer in 1968 and 67 and 68 to declaring the belief that the war in Vietnam was immoral. And the establishment feared, the national intelligence establishment and defense establishment feared that he was going to tell black teenagers not to register for the draft and not to honor induction notices. That's all in the documents that are referenced in the book. So if you want to see exactly what those are, you need to get a copy of the book, but it's all there. And likewise, they were afraid that he was going to tell black soldiers and Marines to lay down their weapons and not go on patrol in hostile territory. So all of this would have meant that the war, the entire burden of the war, the draft, which was increasingly unpopular, was going to be an all-white affair. And so the documents show that they were concerned about essentially a race war. Of course, that's a hypothetical question because it didn't happen. And so we'll never know whether it would happen. Some events intervened. So let's talk about the background of the crime now, moving along. This is just a bit of a historical refresher. Of course, King was in Memphis supporting city sanitation workers strike. They were trying to unionize, and most of the employees of the sanitation department at that time were black. It didn't help the situation that Mayor Henry Loeb, who was the first Jewish elected mayor of any large city in America, even before New York, referred to the city sanitation workers as my Negroes. It was a different day. So April 4th, 1968, King was shot on the second story balcony of the catwalk of the Lorraine Motel. James Earl Ray was also in Memphis that day, but this murder was a professional hit, and Ray wasn't a professional at anything. He had been thrown out of the Army as inept. I mean, if you can imagine, in the 1950s, in the Korea era, you're not even competent cannon fodder. So this was it was an expert shot by an expert rifleman. They fired a single shot from a remote concealed location. Nobody saw the muzzle flash. Nobody saw the gun. Nobody saw the shot. Most everybody thought it was a firecracker or a car backfire, and the shooter escaped from the scene with the weapon. Now, that's not a guy who was too inept to finish the last couple of months of his hitch in the infantry. So almost immediately, the authorities were looking for a white man in a white Mustang. Now, this was racially volatile Memphis. Everybody, white or black, knew exactly what the deal was when they heard that a white man in a white Mustang probably was the one who shot the leading black leader in the country. So Ray was a careful, chosen patsy, and I wish I had time to go into that because that's I devote a few pages to that. It's a very interesting story. Who was manipulated into place like a pawn on a chessboard, really. He was the butt of the conspiracy to kill King and to play a believable storyline constructed him. But he knew nothing about what had happened until the whole thing was too late. So you had a professional hit and a carefully constructed storyline that was immediately parroted by the Department of Justice. The U.S. Attorney General flew into Memphis the next morning. They hadn't even done the ballistics on the rifle they had found, and said this was the work of one man, no widespread conspiracy. There was a storyline by the FBI, the Memphis Police Department, local prosecutors, and most importantly, the TV networks, the New York Times, and within the month, the Saturday Evening Post, Life, and Look magazines. All of them were important media sources then. Had all bought into this line, and eventually, of course, the big publishing houses in New York helped sustain this. So it was a white man in a white Mustang who shot King out of racial hatred. The act was played out in a southern city to make the whole storyline believable to Southerners and Northerners. So let's touch on the orchestration of the storyline just for a moment here, not spending too much time because it's all in the book. So I did a fairly extensive historiography and analysis of 4 of the major published works that helped frame, no pun intended, the storyline about James Earl Ray. The first off was He Slew the Dreamer, which was written by William Bradford Huey, well-known author, TV guy, playwright. He had one of his books, The Americanization of Emily, had already been turned into a movie. So this guy had already made a lot of money by then. And he had an agreement. Huey had an agreement with James Earl Ray and his attorneys, Art Haynes, Senior and Junior, and I hope Judge Haynes maybe is listening from Birmingham. And the original title of the work agreed to that Huey was going to write about Ray's story was We Slew the Dreamer. When it came out, it was He Slew the Dreamer. The Making of an Assassin was another major work that was by George Macmillan, who had been a propaganda writer for the Office of War Information during World War II. So he was just continuing on doing what he had always done. And his was the first hard-hitting, although almost entirely false attempt to identify a number of racially charged instances that Ray supposedly had been involved in. The House Select Committee on Assassinations in the mid-70s looked at every one of these allegations. They could prove none of them, and they disproved as utterly false about 3/4 of them. Then you had Killing the Dream by Gerald Posner, who's a lot of people think he's pretty absorbed with himself. And then more recently, Hellhound on His Heels, which is almost a travel log. Now, the difference between myself and these four guys is I interviewed James Earl Ray 4 times in the early 90s, 3 times in person in 2 different prisons, and once on the phone. None of these guys ever met him. Now, they spent a lot of time with his brother Jerry, and I spent some time with Jerry, but they never met James Earl Ray. Now, the most important writers who influenced the public view of both Ray and Lee Harvey Oswald were the previously mentioned George Macmillan, The Making of an Assassin, and his wife, Priscilla Johnson Macmillan, who turns out was a CIA asset, and that was released in the most recent data dump the last couple of years. And she supposedly met Oswald in Moscow in 1959, but that's a different story. These 2 people had the greatest influence on creating and maintaining the government storyline, and both of them were very significantly connected. Thank you, my dear, with the national intelligence agencies. So the storyline is Ray was a Southern white racist, a nobody who wanted to be somebody, and he did it for the money. So now let's go on to fingerprints of CIA, because this addresses some of these other issues. I have 7 of these, which I'll go through pretty quickly. We doing all right with time, Brian?
Yeah, we're doing just fine.
Okay, great. The number one indicator is money. They said Ray did this for money. Well, Ray had escaped from the Missouri penitentiary 50 weeks before the King assassination, and in late April of 1967, 50 weeks prior to the murder in Memphis. And he had the best year of his life. Here's a guy who'd never really worked. He'd served time in Florida, Missouri, Illinois, California, and Leavenworth and the federal system before he ever went to Memphis. And then he served, of course, 29 years in Tennessee. But he'd never had anything. And yet this 50 weeks before the King assassination, he bought a fastback Mustang. He bought expensive photography equipment. He spent the winter in Mexico and L.A., which is probably not a bad thing to do, at least back then. I don't think I'd want to go to Mexico much now, but so it was the best year of his life. And the House Select Committee on Assassinations and all of these other writers have tried to say, well, he knew there was a pot of money out there somewhere. The FBI never found a pot of money. But what they did find is this: he did have money. He had plenty of money. He didn't have to commit crimes. He didn't have to rob people. He was a petty thief. The only thing close to violence in terms of crime that he ever did was he was involved in a stick up at a Kroger and with a partner of his. And as they were running to the car, he dropped his 38 on the pavement and shot him in the leg. That was the closest he got to ever harming anybody. Now, another thing. So this money came from somewhere. It came from Raoul. He had a handler. The government says Raoul never existed. The money existed. He went all over the place. Drove back and forth from New Orleans to L.A. 2 or 3 times. So in the Trump and Biden era data dumps from the JFK assassinations collection, and there are hundreds, probably more like thousands of documents related to the King assassination that got caught up in that collection. One of those documents purports to be, or is, a CIA document that purports to accuse someone of appearing at the Cuban embassy in Mexico City in 1967 that they thought was rape. Well, this is eerily similar to the same allegation that was made against Oswald 5 years before, that he showed up at the Cuban embassy in Mexico City a month before the Kennedy assassination. Now, we could discuss this and debate this. This is a very interactive thing. There are a lot of moving parts on that, but the pictures that they sent out, very low quality, too low quality to publish. You can get them in the NARA document, which is cited in my book, the National Archives and Records Administration. I've given the reference, the number of the document. You can go to that document and pull it up online, and you'll see for yourself that's not rape. Just like the one 5 years before, it wasn't Oswald. But so they make these allegations, and it's very interesting. This had never surfaced before the last couple of years. Another indication of CIA involvement, national intelligence involvement, is that Raoul sent Ray crisscrossing the South. He was in Birmingham and Atlanta and New Orleans. Eventually, he went through Mississippi and Memphis. He was all over the place. And Ray undoubtedly didn't know this, but they had him crisscrossing several cities at or near the time where King was appearing. But there's absolutely no indication whatsoever that he even knew that. They didn't even try to prove that. It was just an allegation that they made. Now, probably the most damning thing about the whole CIA involvement, one of them, is Ray's Canadian aliases. He used 4 aliases during the 14 or so months he was on the lam, because he escaped Memphis, got to Atlanta, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But the these four aliases, actually they were personas. He was virtually impersonating these people. They weren't just aliases, because these were real, live, middle-aged Canadian men, all about that lived within a 5-mile radius of each other in Toronto. Apparently, did not know each other. They were all about 5'10". They had dark hair. They had light eyes. They were white males, medium build. And I have a panel of pictures in the book, and you can see they all look very similar to Ray. A couple of them are almost dead ringers. And the alias that Ray used for the longest period of time was Eric S. Galt. And the real Eric S. Galt was a Union Carbide Canada employee with a top secret clearance in Canada, working on U.S. Defense Department contracts up there. And Galt had a scar over his left eye and a scar on his right palm, as Ray did. Now, I won't go into the details explaining how this connects and how all that happened. But the same organization that opened the initial CIA 201 file, a person of interest file, on Ray was James Jesus Angleton's counterintelligence unit. And that's who I think supplied him with the aliases. Now, let's look at the escape. Here you've got a guy, don't forget, he's not real bright. He was discharged less than honorably for ineptness. And the whole world's looking for him by 7 o'clock on the evening of April 4th, 1968. And in the era before interstate highways, Ray drove from Memphis to Atlanta. If you look at any old map and the original U.S. highways, he had to go through about 8 or 10 county seats. And most of them were all the same way. The main highway went right by the courthouse. So you went right through the middle of town, 8 or 10 towns, and with an APB out looking for a white man and a white Mustang. He made it to Atlanta anyway. 2 days later, while a subject of the largest manhunt in the history of North America, he took the bus to Canada and crossed over into Canada. So the whole escape part of the story has never really been fleshed out, but it screams of intervention. So when Ray then, after the crime, he'd crossed into Canada, he was in Toronto. He stayed about 2 or 3 weeks in Toronto, and he went to a rooming house, rented a room. He had a caller that came to that particular place looking for him. And by then he had changed. He had changed to another Canadian alias, a Paul Bridgman. Someone came looking for Ray at the correct rooming house where he was staying. He wasn't in at the time, asking for him by the name of the current alias he was using. He moved to another rooming house, and in another week, and changed his name again. He began using a the alias Sneed, who interestingly was a Toronto cop in real life. And someone called that rooming house. Again, Ray wasn't in, but the landlady answered the phone, and they wanted to speak to Mr. Sneed. So you had at least two people, and one of these people was described as a fat man, and the other one was described as a slight man. So you had two different people who knew the current alias of James Earl Ray and where he was staying in Toronto, and they were making calls on it. Now, the one of the most interesting things about the whole escape from Canada was Ray's passport. He got the name of this Canadian cop, Ramon George Sneed, applied for a birth certificate. The province of Ontario issued the birth certificate, and I've got a copy of that birth certificate in the book, and a copy of his approved passport application. And his approved passport application shows the approval date of April 24th, 1968. Interestingly, that's the same date, April 24th, that the province of Ontario issued Ray a copy of the birth certificate for George Ramon Sneed, in whose name he got the passport issued. So I doubt if the State Department or the Canadians could really issue anybody's passport in the same day unless they were a diplomat going on a mission somewhere. So anyway, that's all I had to say. There's so many more topics in the book. There's very intriguing misbehavior, lying to the court by Percy Foreman, who helped beat Ray down into a guilty plea. There's the death of two judges 5 years apart who had undecided motions before their court on their docket that they never got a chance to decide about James Earl Ray, on the James Earl Ray case, on the appeal. And so I hope you'll buy the book, and I'd love to answer any questions.
Well, let's first start with some of the hard evidence that people, and there's been several questions about this. First,
yeah.
What about the ballistics on the rifle or Ray's fingerprints or any of that? How does that square with your research and evidence and the conclusions that you drew?
Number one, the rifle was tested twice, and they could not exclude the rifle. They couldn't prove that it fired the slug that was removed from Martin Luther King's body at the emergency room in Memphis. It was they wouldn't say that it wasn't the murder weapon. They just said we couldn't exclude it. The FBI couldn't exclude it. Then that was in '68, and then when the House Select Committee on Assassinations was stood up by the U.S. House in '76, they got custody of all of that evidence, including the rifle. They ran their own separate independent ballistic tests, and likewise, they could neither prove nor exclude the rifle. Now, later on, many years later, Ray went back to state court. This was long after all of his appeals had been exhausted about his plea. And his lawyers were asking the court to allow them access to the rifle because more accurate ballistic tests had been developed, and the state wouldn't let them do it. I mean, why, if you're a prosecutor, why would you agree to that? I mean, what happens if the rifle is excluded rather than just a big question mark, rather than just part of your allegation that nobody can say yes or no? Now, the rifle did have one palm print of Ray's on it, and they found it in a green bundle that had been thrown down in a little alcove in a store next to the rooming house that he had stayed in on South Main Street in Memphis. And that was the only physical connection between Ray and the crime.
Now, were there any witnesses at that boarding house that saw Ray? I mean, because there's some questions about that. Were there people that actually saw him or could attach him to the situation where he was there and then, of course, went on the run? Anybody
No,
that saw anything?
there weren't any. There weren't any eyewitnesses. I mean, they saw somebody. Of course, they're assuming that the shot was fired from the bathroom that the government alleged it was fired from. Some witnesses saw somebody, but no one could identify Ray.
Now, we know that the King family has come out and said that they don't think that James Earl Ray did it. They think that there was some other conspiracy to this. There's a question as to why wouldn't the Democrats in 2000 side with the King family and say, well, there was something going on here. Is it just because they're simply covering up for the establishment, the deep state? I mean, is that what they're trying to do? They're just backfilling. Why wouldn't they side with the family and, of course, gain political points for that? In other words, is there a political side to an angle to this too, in all of the cover up or the different misinformation or the different narratives? Is there something to that as well?
Well, no doubt no doubt. If the Democrats at that point, you mentioned 2000, if they had something less than 95% of the black vote was going to vote Democrat, it doesn't make any difference. Why would you concede anything? Then you have to give up. Then you have to say, and this is why such an elaborate scheme has been undertaken and maintained for decades. What is the one thing that most progressives and most Americans, for that matter, even conservatives, some conservatives, let's put it that way, believe is the one legitimate benefit that the government has brought to the American people? It's racial justice.
Right.
It's racial justice. Now, what if they had to say, well, we kind of messed up on that one. We did have to kill somebody. I mean,
and a big figure as well. I mean, you're not talking about some.
And it would completely discredit, completely. You're talking about apathy and cynicism, and we see all the reasons, all the legitimate reasons people are apathetic and cynical today. I think you'd be orders of magnitude above that.
What got you interested in this topic? I mean, because it's something that, as I said, it's a very personal book when you read it.
Yeah.
And so why did you decide to write it?
Well, my great uncle Harry Avery, my mother's uncle, was commissioner of correction at the time. That's head of the whole prison department, state of Tennessee, at the time that Ray was incarcerated and his guilty plea was entered in Memphis, and he was shipped off. They put him in a phalanx of 100-mile-an-hour state trooper cars, and they made record time from Memphis to Nashville on the ground. Anyway, and he was pretty much at the end of his career, his adult working life, and he had been an arson investigator for 30 years before the first of two governors appointed him and then reappointed him to the position of commissioner of correction. And he began his own investigation and kept his own evidence file. And all that's in the book. We don't have time to, I'll spend 15 minutes if I get off in that ditch. But James Earl Ray gave me two cassette tapes the first time I met him. And this was in about 91. And he said, these cassette tapes are an interview of your uncle. And he said, I've had them in my cell for 13 years. I got a picture of them in the book. And I had to listen. The tapes are a little choppy, but I listened to them 4 or 5 times before it kind of dawned on me. Oh, yeah, I get what he was saying. He's talking about a little bit over here and a little bit over there and a little bit over there. But he had certainly concluded that James Earl Ray, which he referred to as a nitwit, two-bit felon, and that's all, quote unquote. There's no way a nitwit can track down somebody whose movements are not necessarily all that publicized in advance and commit a very sophisticated crime all by himself.
Now we know that King was being
so I had some conversations with him about that long ago, and I wish I had followed up earlier, but eventually I got around to it.
We know King. You bring up where Ray wasn't really able to. The story is, of course, he saw King was going to be in Memphis. He drove to Memphis,
right.
But to know that exact location at the exact time, we know King was being surveilled by all the deep state agencies. I mean, he was a prime target of Hoover's FBI. They knew all about him. So it makes it, it would have been difficult for Ray to know where to be at the exact time without some other kind of prior knowledge, an internal, maybe somebody from King's own group. Would he have been able to gather that information, or was it something that you would have had to have known as a close associate of King or someone who was surveilling him where he was going to be at that particular time at that hotel?
Well, you've hit on something that that really belies much of the work of a couple of these authors that I've talked about, because two of them in particular cite a front page story in the Memphis Press Scimitar, which was the afternoon paper at the time. It went out of publication in the 90s, I think, when all the afternoon papers bit the dust around the country. A front page story that they say in their works, Posner and Hampton Sides, that Ray read about it in the paper. Well, I went to the paper morgue and I looked at every page the whole time Ray was in Memphis. I mean, that King was in Memphis. And it didn't say what they said. And in fact, I confronted by email with Hampton Sides, and he sort of sheepishly admitted, well, yeah, I guess we probably messed up on that one. We didn't, we conflated something that somebody else has said, and it'll be changed in the next edition. It wasn't. So that was the establishment's effort to prove that Ray knew where King was, and it was a lie. It was completely made up out of whole cloth.
Huh. I mean, it's fascinating that there are these big questions that you have to answer. A man that I mean, think about this now. If there's a major political figure, how would any of us know where that person is going to be at any particular time, at any given in a hotel or a exact location, without having some kind of inside information? And then be able to, I mean, it's nearly impossible. And King, of course, was well protected. People, he knew that he was in danger at times. So this is not someone who was going to be careless about his location or other things. So it doesn't make any sense that
Well,
someone, as you're saying, would have
actually,
this kind of
he
information.
wasn't very well protected. The Memphis Police Department met him at the airport on I guess that would have been April the 3rd, and offered to surround him with an entourage of policemen. And not too surprisingly, he declined. I mean, he didn't trust the cops.
Hmm.
Uh, Everybody was spying on him. And in fact, you mentioned King insiders. No, Ray certainly didn't have any information from any King insiders, but the FBI had a paid informant. Withers was Dr. King's photographer, and he gave numerous reports every day. Uh, Slipped them along to the FBI about where King was, what he was doing, who he was talking to, what they were talking about, where they were, and those sorts of things. Now, the one other thing about the location here, or that something that you said that triggered my thoughts about that. In 1993, let's see, is that the correct year? Yeah, that was 25 years after the crime. 1968, 25 years brings us to 1993. The Commercial Appeal broke the story that the U.S. Army had two secret, wasn't a platoon, I've forgotten what they called them, but two groups surveilling Dr. King in Memphis. Now, they had denied that for 25 years. What happened is, in a Freedom of Information Act document, they failed to block out and excise a couple of the names, and the reporter got to calling around, and the guy, somebody admitted, yeah, I was in that group. We were there. We were right there. So here you have another situation where you got James Earl Ray, an inept guy who they never even asked whether he tried to sight in the telescopic sight on that rifle. The guy who sold it to him in Birmingham said he knew nothing about rifles. He said, I could tell that when I was talking to him trying to sell him this gun. He didn't know anything about rifles. So this guy just was completely incapable of doing what the government said he was doing. And if he had been in that room, you had about 40 policemen and deputies in the immediate vicinity that swarmed out in the streets out of a fire department. You had firemen right next door, fire department right next door. You had the FBI there. You had the U.S. Army there with perhaps 12 to 15 people secretly. U.S. Marshals. This guy would have had to practically elbow his way through a crowd of armed lawmen. And here he's a felon with on the lam with 20 years hanging over his head, and carrying a rifle to get up to that bathroom to shoot King. It's beyond anything a rational thinking person would believe, except that you've been preached this by all of these establishment sources for so long.
One person brought up in the chat, it's kind of odd that a man would buy a rifle on March 30th and then not practice at all with it, and
Yeah.
then be able to shoot King just a few days later, one shot. And I mean, a
But
perfect shot essentially, and be
yeah.
able to do that without any training, any mission param, nothing. Just go out there and do it. It almost just
Well, on top
was
of
the
that, when
imagination.
you get back to the rifle and the ballistics and the green bundle, that the rifle was supposedly Ray wrapped it up in the green blanket that was on the bed of the flop house. That's the storyline. And he had his transistor radio that had his prison number scratched in it, that was in the green bundle, and a couple of bottles of beer and this, that, and the other, and threw it down. The rifle had no rounds in it. So here's a guy who, if you believe what the government says, he loaded one round into the rifle, fired it, and then ran. And now those are not high capacity magazines, but those magazines, I have a Remington 30-06 I use for deer hunting that's very similar to the alleged rifle here, which is a slide action. Mine's an automatic, but the magazine, it's the same magazine. It holds 4 rounds and one in the chamber. So you had, if that was the murder weapon, you had somebody so supremely confident that they were going to hit their target with one round, they wouldn't need any more, and B, they're going to be able to escape without having to shoot their way out anywhere.
Well, is it odd? I mean, one thing. Now we've been it's been nearly, what, we're rocking on a good distance from this now. We're
Oh
looking
yeah,
at 60 years.
yeah.
That nobody has come forward. The shooter, I mean, nobody's ever come forward with any of this. Do you think there will ever be a time when somebody might? I mean, there might be some confession somewhere down the road that I was the one that did it.
I think in all likelihood, whoever did it's probably dead by now. This is uh, cowboys tell stories. We know there are paid assassins all over the world. They never talk.
What was your impression of Ray when you met him? Did you share your uncle's impression of him, or did you have a different
Well,
impression?
he was obviously a uneducated person who oddly was very well read. Of course, by then he had let's see, 91. He had had over 15 years of reading on his hands, and so he was well informed, uh, but not really an intelligent person.
Hmm. Now, this is a fascinating book, and I mean it's a great topic, because people are very interested in these things now with the Kennedy assassination, and I mean, put these two together and what was supposed to happen in the Trump administration, and then of course didn't, and all the documents weren't released as he promised. And so it's fascinating that the administration still continue to cover this up. And I think again, that's where people get hung up on it. What would be the motivation now, so many years on, when people already are cynical I mean, as you said, they're cynical anyways. The King family has already said they believe that somebody else did it, that, or, Ray, that you've had people say that they think that other things happened. Why wouldn't the government just admit it at this point? And all the actors are dead. It's all done. Is it just because of, again, the ability to say that there is a narrative and that we are not the bad guy? The government is not the bad guy in this particular situation, and to protect the CIA and the FBI.
That's got to be it, 100%. And one final point here, Brian, on the I don't have my calendar out in front of me, but on the weekend of July 4th this year, uh, after all the newsrooms had at 5:30 on the afternoon. Yeah, I guess that was probably maybe June 30th. July 1st was a Saturday. After all the newsrooms pretty well vacated, the Biden administration released an executive order that purports to have completely abided by the JFK Records Act of 1992, which Biden voted for when he was in the Senate, and requires the release of all the documents. Now, they've said, well, we've we released everything we're going to release, so we released it all, and now nothing. There's nothing left to see. Move along here. So, and that's I think 4,000 or 5,000 documents, which most people who've ever looked at this on the left and the right think that's where we'll find out some more stuff.
Hmm. So
But
you think
we may never see them again.
right? So you think that there's still some information that needs to be come through that perhaps could.
Oh, there's several thousand documents, which, for all practical purposes, the Biden administration announced right before the 4th of July weekend. Nobody's ever going to see. Public's never going to see them.
Wow, that's amazing. And again, it's a it's a travesty of justice in many ways. And as I said from the beginning, this book is very sympathetic towards King and in the situation. This was a major political figure in a political assassination, and it is a tragic story because of so many actors involved, families involved, lives were ruined. Obviously, the implications for the United States moving forward. It's a great story, and it is a. I ended up it's behind you, but again, one more time. State Assassination, Martin Luther King, and from Shotwell Press. You can get it at Amazon. It's a great book. It's a good read, and I highly recommend you all pick it up. But John, this has been really fun, and I hope you sell some books off of it. And we appreciate you coming out for this webinar.
I'm glad to be invited and participate. Had a great time.
Well, again, this is our first webinar of 2024. We've got one coming up in February. Be on the lookout for that. It's going to be on a really fun topic on the farmers' revolt in Georgia when they drove their tractors all the way to Washington, D.C. and wanted to show Jimmy Carter up. It's going to be a fun event. So we're looking forward to that one. We've got another webinar coming up in March on the 14th Amendment, which is going to be great. So we've got some really cool things in the future. And so we appreciate everyone's support. This will be available on YouTube following this probably by tomorrow. So be on the lookout for that. We appreciate everyone's support, and we hope to see you at the next one. John, thanks for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Have a good one.